Good afternoon, friends, participants, and supporters. Welcome to the latest iteration of the NPDL spring lineup featuring our two amazing teams here on site at MCC and Maine DOC and Boston College. Give everyone a warm welcome. Great to see you all here. I'd also like to acknowledge my NPDL teammates who've made this historic event possible. Assistant Director Brittany Lamar, Director of Education and Training, Professor John Katsulas, and American Debate Association President Patrick Waldinger. Very special thanks are also in order. Thank you. Very special thanks are also in order for Maine DOC, especially Commissioner Randall Liberty, Deputy Commissioner Anthony Cantillo, and Tricia Clark and Philip Patoco, and so many others who have made today's event possible. And I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of our women's team who's in the house today to support this event. They're on deck next week to face Harvard. So it's cool that we're all able to share the same space today in this groundbreaking fashion. So Victoria and the women at WRC, welcome, welcome. You are all about to witness not just a dynamic policy debate, which is what we do, but you're also about to really experience what decarcerating human minds looks like. And that is the power that you'll see on full display here by these two amazing teams on this very important subject matter of environmental policy. Today's debate topic, the resolution itself, is resolved. The United States federal government should impose a economy-wide carbon tax. Arguing in the affirmative in favor of instituting such a tax will be Boston College's Fulton Debating Society, and arguing in the negative against imposing such a tax and refuting BC's case will be our team from MCC. We have 5 very distinguished judges in the field who will be judging today's debate on a virtual panel. Our chief judge is David Cram-Helwich. He's the director of debate at the University of Minnesota and the chair of the National Debate Tournament Appeals Committee. Thank you, David. Also on the panel is Frank Irizarry. He's the director of debate at Suffolk University and the former director of debate at the University of Florida. Our other judges are Danielle O'Gorman, director of debate at United States Naval Academy and former president of the American Debate Association. Matthew Mitchell, Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center and Professor of Economics at George Mason University. And Sally Davidson, PhD in Economics from Columbia University, where she taught macroeconomics, finance, and economic history, currently on faculty at Emerson College. As today's moderator, I will introduce our debaters individually, and they will appear here at these lecterns and adhere to specific time limits, which will be announced. A digital timer will be displayed on the screen. And once speakers reach their maximum time, those microphones will be muted and they'll be asked to cede those lecterns. At the conclusion of the debate, our judges will tally up the cumulative team scores, submit them to our chief judge, who will then be introduced to announce the winner of today's contest. With all of that said, I'd like to briefly introduce both of our full teams. So I'll start on my left with Maine Correctional and Ross Adams. Ross, you want to stand up for a moment, sir? Ross is someone here from Farmington, Maine, born and raised on a homestead. He was very much someone who believed in the value of hard work and education, and he is pursuing his education here in Maine. Thank you, Ross. Welcome. Next up is Chris Murray. Chris, you want to stand up, sir? Introduce yourself. This is Chris. Chris is pursuing a master's in divinity, and he is originally from Red Springs, North Carolina. Welcome, Chris. Next up, we have Jason DeLong. Jason is pursuing his MBA, and again, is someone who very much, captures the spirit of higher education in prison. And Jason, thank you very much for joining this debate. Chandler Dougal is a graduate student. Chandler, come on up. And he's seeking his master's in public administration. He has many credentials. All of these bios will be listed online, by the way, because they're lengthy. A lot of accomplished individuals here. Chandler also has the unique distinction of being the only veteran on the team. He was the co-captain of last year's team with Victoria Scott, the other co-captain in attendance, who were able to launch our inaugural event with MIT. Chandler, welcome back. Patrick Dapolito, come on up, Patrick. Welcome. Patrick hails from Boston, Mass. Originally, but now considers Upton, Maine home a long time, Upton, Maine. And again, Patrick, thank you very much for joining us here and pursuing this new pursuit with not just education, but what you're doing in trying to represent what that looks like here today. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you.
Nick Drake is actually pursuing his passion of nonprofit organization, and that's what we are. So it's cool to see someone else in the space and to have you joining us here today. Patrick, thank you. Nicholas, thank you. And finally, Jared Sherwater. Jared, thank you very much. Jared is from Northam, Maine, and he is pursuing his MBA.
What was it? Associates at the moment.
Okay, and with aspirations for grad school.
No, I'm going for my what was it? Health and Human Services.
Health and Human Services. Sorry about that. And thank you very much for joining us. And that rounds out the main team. Thank you very much. All right, now from Boston College's prestigious Fulton Debating Society. You mind standing up as I introduce you in turn? Terrence King from Brooklyn, New York. Welcome. Welcome, Terrence. Next up, Christopher Cheek, from sophomore, Nashville, Tennessee. Now we have Owen Engler he's a senior. He's looking to get into law school, and he is originally from Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts. Okay, next up we have John Sexton, a freshman from Houston, Texas. Houston. And our final member of BC's contingent today is Nora Feeney. She is a sophomore from Brighton, Mass. Welcome, Nora. All right, now we're going to get into the heart of the debate. Each team will be introduced in turn, and these times will be counted down on the screen, as I'd mentioned before, and the judges will begin scoring. All of your times will begin as soon as you make your first audible sound, and your microphones will be muted if you go over your maximum time. So everyone, good luck. Enjoy this brilliant interaction, and let's see how it all shakes out. Economic policy, environmental policy, two very important subjects, and we hope that we can hash out a greater understanding of what a better world could look like based on your presentations here today. So thank you all very much for that. Leading us off from the affirmative team, Boston College's first constructive affirmative speech, 7 to 9 minutes. Please give a warm NPDL welcome to Mr. Terrence King. Terrence.
All right. Good afternoon. Boston College stands resolved. The United States federal government should enact an economy-wide carbon tax. We will support the resolution with the following 3 contentions, beginning with contention 1. U.S. climate policies are failing. The Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, approved in August 2022, provides $369 billion in incentives and subsidies for promoting clean energy. While better than nothing, the IRA will not rapidly or broadly reduce the U.S. greenhouse gas emissions for 3 reasons. First, the IRA will not achieve the emission reduction promised by the U.S. under the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. In 2019, the US committed to reducing its emission by 50% of pre-2005 levels. Dr. James Boyce, an economic professor emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, was quoted in the Clean Energy Finance Forum in February 2nd, 2023, that the IRA is not going to put us on track to meet the carbon reduction goals under the Paris Agreement. Boyce argued that it is unlikely that the IRA will spur the necessary reduction in greenhouse gas emissions necessary to achieve a 50% reduction. The second problem with the IRA is that it does nothing to phase out the dirtiest fuels like coal. The climate policy that depends entirely on subsidies and does not impose a financial penalty on using fossil fuels, says Leela Jones of Grits magazine, means the dirtiest sources won't necessarily be phased out the fastest. To illustrate why this is a problem, consider what happens when the IRA subsidies leads to more purchases of electric vehicles. Shutting Permulo of Nitskin Center explained in 2022 that while the clean vehicle credits will promote the purchase of EVs, the owners of EVs will be recharging their vehicle with electricity generated by coal plants. This is not a recipe for lowering carbon emissions. The third problem with the IRA is that it will discourage energy conservation. By artificially lowering the price of energy, the IRA will increase energy use. The Carbon Tax Center stated in 2022 that the IRA will weaken the microeconomic case for virtually every conservation investment. Contention 2. Climate change is real and a danger to the planet. The best scientific evidence established that greenhouse gas emissions from humans is causing global warming. The 2021 study of the environmental research later examined a database of 88,125 climate-related papers published since 2012. The authors randomly looked at 3,000 of them and found that only 4 skeptical papers. The lead author, Mark Linus of Cornell, wrote, we conclude high statistical confidence that the scientific consensus on human-caused contemporary climate change exceeds 99% of its peer-reviewed scientific literature. In March 2023, the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, or the IPCC, issued its 6th synthesis report. This study, prepared by thousands of the best scientists, warned that the world is likely to pass a dangerous temperature threshold within the next 10 years, unless nations take much greater actions to transition away from fossil fuels. Sarah Kaplan, reporting in the Washington Post on March 20th, 2023, wrote that the IPCC study predicted if warming is not slowed, climate disasters will become so extreme that people will not be able to adapt. Basic components of the Earth's systems will be fundamentally and irrevocably altered. Heat waves, famines, and infectious diseases could claim millions of additional lives. Another study by the prestigious National Academy of Sciences argued in 2022 that climate models are likely underestimating the dangers by ignoring feedback loops in the carbon cycles. Examples of these cited by the NAS include permafrost thawing, releasing methane, and the dieback of Amazon rainforest, releasing CO2. Luke Kemp of the University of Cambridge, the lead author of the NAS report, warns a climate change pose an existential threat if feedback amplifying warming to an irrevocably transition into greenhouse hothouse Earth states. In that scenario, Kemp stated that the Earth would experience its 6th mass extinction event. To avoid catastrophic climate change, the affirmative advocates the following plan. The United States federal government will enact an economy-wide carbon tax and broader adjustment tax advocated by the Climate Leadership Council. Contention 3, economy-wide carbon tax is the best solution. The Climate Leadership Council plan enacts a carbon tax starting at $40 per ton, which increases at an annual 5% above inflation. The revenue from the tax is rebated as a dividend to all U.S. households. The domestic tax is paired with a broader carbon adjustment tax imposed on foreign goods imported to the U.S. The CLC carbon tax will reduce emissions enough to put the U.S. into compliance with its Paris commitments. Gilbert E. Metcalf, professor of economics at Tufts University, stated in 2020 that an economic model from Stanford and Resources for the Future suggests that the CLC proposals would create an immediate 18% reduction in emissions and a 50% reductions by 2035, relative to the US economy without a carbon tax. This puts the country well on track to becoming carbon-free by mid-century. By pairing the carbon tax with a broader carbon adjustment, the CLC plan will encourage other nations to take broader action to reduce their emissions. George Shultz, former Secretary of State, and Ted Halstead, Climate Leadership Council CEO, argued in 2020 that a broader carbon adjustment offers the best way for the US to push other nations towards serious climate action and prevent them from free riding. By including trade goods in the scope of our carbon pricing, we can encourage greater climate ambitions globally. The US can encourage our closest trading partners in Europe and North America who have interest in a broader carbon adjustment to join us in forming the unions around a common carbon price and trade policy, which would give the United States the market leverage needed to encourage China, India, and other major economies to increase their climate ambition. Finally, the Stanford Model Lane study proves a revenue neutral carbon tax of $40 will reduce the economic growth by only 0.1%. This is a small cost. This small cost is outweighed by the economic benefits of reducing air pollution and slowing climate change. Dana Nutelli reported these findings in The Guardian in July 16, 2018. 11 teams in recent Stanford energy modeling forum projects revenue neutral carbon tax would slightly slow the economic growth, but by an amount that would be more than offset by the benefits of cutting pollutions and slowing global warming. CLC proposes a $40 per ton in every model. The US economy continues to grow, deviating by no more than 0.1%. We find robust evidence that even the most ambitious carbon tax is consistent with long-term positive economic growth, not even counting the growth benefits of a less disrupted climate or lower ambient air pollution. Phasing out coal plants results in significant health and economic benefits to society. Thus, Boston College stands resolved.
As this is the portion in which we'll have some cross-examination from your opponents. So we will start as soon as we are ready. We have 3 minutes of cross-examination from the negative team. And please give a warm welcome to Mr. Patrick D'Appolito.
Thank you, Terrence. My first question is, how did you arrive at $40 per ton tax specifically?
Well, we see that $40 is just the model that the CLC Council is looking at currently. That's based on their what economists estimate would be needed to put companies put pressure on companies to continue to try to get us to that Paris Agreement. But other countries, I mentioned that we can come with our other partners in North America and Europe to figure out the price more and come to a common agreement.
Thank you. I'm going to move on. So how do you plan to utilize the revenue generated by your tax?
Yeah, so the revenue will go to households. The money that's generated will go directly to households. So yeah, as in the form of a dividend.
Thank you. Do you believe that the largest or the most egregious carbon emitters should be the ones to bear the brunt of this tax?
Well, wait, yeah.
Yes. Well, if that's the case, what disincentivizes companies from just passing this on to consumers?
Well, passing the tax
right on to consumers.
Well,
by raising the prices.
Raising the prices. Well,
Sure.
That is why this model proposes dividend go directly to the household, because that way then poor Americans who are more financially challenged will be able to fiat that cost.
Sure.
And not have to face extra burden.
Thank you.
Yeah.
But my question is, if you're going to charge egregious emitters and pass the rebate back on to the consumers who are going to pay the brunt of the tax, and if the government is just going to pass the money back to the consumers, how does this disincentivize anybody from emitting carbon?
Well, you're saying that they're just gonna do you have any evidence that these companies are gonna raise the price, or is this
No, but what evidence do you have that they're not going to?
Well, that's what our plan takes into account. If in the hypothetical that companies do raise the price, we see that by giving the dividend onto these households will not be negatively affected and will be able to survive any cost increase.
Thank you. And so what mechanisms do you have in place that if companies just pass this on, just pass on the tax? Is it simply the rebate?
Well, yeah, unless you like give me an example in which to work with, I don't like.
I'm gonna move on. So do you believe that the goals set out in the Paris Climate Accord, you said that you believe that they're
Yeah.
sufficient, right? So if we were on track to meet those goals, would we still require a carbon tax?
Well, we see right now we're not on track by any means to meet the goals currently, which is why we even need the tax to begin with.
Right, this was a hypothetical, though. If we were
So
on
once
track,
we're on goal, I would say the tax is needed to continue so that to make sure that we don't go backwards and go
Thank
back to a position that was detrimental and kept us off course.
Lito. Moving into our third speaker. Also representing the negative team from MCC opposing this tax. Your first negative constructive 7 to 9 minutes. Please give a warm welcome to Mr. Chandler Dougal. Chandler.
At the onset of policy implementation discussions, we must realize that we have departed the realm of theory for reality, and reality confounds. No amount of theoretical equivocation can overcome the real-world consequences of this resolution. Furthermore, the status quo is not stagnation. Society is already moving towards a prosperous green energy future despite our opponents' claims. In this speech, we advance 5 arguments which prove the imprudence of the proposition. First, we shall show that the end impacts of climate change are overstated. The climate is changing. But though our situation is serious, it is not apocalyptic. Gianluca Alimanti, a nuclear physicist at the University of Milan, argued in a 2022 edition of the European Physical Journal Plus that there has been no statistically significant increase in global droughts, Atlantic hurricanes, or floods, and that there is no conclusive proof that global warming will lead to more. Furthermore, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration concluded in a 2022 report that, quote, "It is premature to conclude with high confidence that increasing atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations from human activities have had a detectable impact on Atlantic basin hurricane activity," unquote. As Dr. Judith Curry of Georgia Tech highlighted in 2022, both the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the International Energy Agency now claim that the previously touted extreme risks of global warming are now implausible. We ask our opponents, is this not enough to satisfy you? For our second point, we contend that current efforts have us on track to successfully mitigate climate change. In his recent State of the Union address, President Biden referred to the Inflation Reduction Act as the most significant investment ever made to combat climate change. The act pursues clean energy with carrots, not with sticks, with market incentives, not autocratic taxation. Patrick Brown of Johns Hopkins University determined last August that the act would attract over $4 trillion in clean energy infrastructure investment, adding to the already substantial $369 billion the act provides. The Rhodium Group, an independent climate research firm, found in 2022 that the Inflation Reduction Act will reduce U.S. greenhouse gas emissions to 32 to 42% below our 2005 levels by the year 2030. Without the act, we are anticipated to reach a 24 to 35% increase over those levels. Is this massive reduction, perhaps a 77% decrease in projected emissions, not enough to satisfy our opponents? According to that same study, as much as 81% of U.S. electricity will come from clean energy sources, and yearly energy costs will decrease by an average of $112 per household by the year 2030. Is this also not enough? In Article 2, Section A of the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, the global community vowed to limit temperature increases to 2 degrees Celsius by 2100, a goal reaffirmed in Section 4 of the 2021 Glasgow Climate Pact. The IPCC's AR6 synthesis report, released just last month, states, and I quote, "Projected cumulative future CO2 emissions over the lifetime of existing and planned fossil fuel infrastructure, if historical operating patterns are maintained and without additional abatement, are approximately equal to the remaining carbon budget for limiting warming to 2 degrees Celsius with a likelihood of 83% high confidence." I repeat, the IPCC report, which our opponents quoted, has stated with high confidence that the status quo without additional abatement, without a carbon tax, will limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius by 2100. A study by the University of Melbourne in 2022 also concluded that current commitments shall keep global warming below this target. Thus, we are already on track to achieve global climate objectives, making a carbon tax unnecessary. Finally, even if we momentarily cross this 2-degree threshold, the aforementioned IPCC report argues that achieving net negative CO2 emissions through carbon capture technology would rectify any overshoot and returns to target levels. Is all of this still not enough? Our third point is undeniable. A carbon tax will severely harm the American economy. America has never instituted an economy-wide tax on any good or service, and for good reason. We must remember the words of Chief Justice John Marshall: "The power to tax is the power to destroy." Basic economic theory holds that increased taxation hinders economic growth. This is illustrated by a 2018 International Monetary Fund study, which found that tax increases of 1% relative to GDP reduce GDP growth by 2% and cause lasting recessionary effects. Furthermore, the National Bureau of Economic Research concluded in 2019 that tax effects on economic output are nonlinear, finding that growth effects become increasingly negative the higher the tax rates are set. Carbon taxes are not immune from the laws of economics. In 2022, economists from the Netherlands Rabobank Institute developed a sophisticated computer model which determined that the United States would see a 1.28 to 1.85% reduction in 2030 GDP compared to status quo levels if our nation and other developed economies, including China, we'll get to that in a minute, adopted a standard carbon tax. Similarly, a 2021 study by the National Institute of Economic and Social Research found that an economy-wide carbon tax would slash the GDP of most developed nations by at least 1 to 2% and would cause inflation to spike by 2.5% in its first year alone. And more inflation is precisely what Americans living below the poverty line need right now. The Institute of Energy Research reported in 2019 that the United States annually emits approximately 15 tons of carbon per capita. Doing some quick math, using our opponent's $40 per ton figure, the proposition will require a collection of $600 in additional taxation for every man, woman, and child in the United States every year. That is a total yearly burden of $198.9 billion, which is equivalent to all federal excise tax, estate tax, and custom duties revenues combined during 2021, according to the Treasury Department. And we have not yet considered our opponent's 5% increase and enforcement and collection costs, which will surely be substantial. The proposition is clearly an enormous tax increase which will hinder economic growth. This is undesirable because reducing economic growth is counterproductive to addressing climate change. The stronger our economy, the better we can develop clean energy technologies and adapt to any negative effects. The International Monetary Fund concluded in 2022 that economic development reduces climate vulnerability and found a, quote, strong positive correlation between adaptation capacity and GDP per capita, and that, quote, progress in developing adaptive capacity can therefore be achieved by promoting economic development, unquote. If we hamstring our economic growth, we reduce our ability to combat climate change. Nightmarish consequences will also arise. Agricultural and food production sectors would be particularly hard hit by this tax due to increased transportation and energy costs. This would increase food prices, jeopardizing the food security of millions. Japan's National Institute for Environmental Studies determined in 2022 that a global carbon tax would increase food prices to the point that 78 to 170 million more people would be at risk of starvation than currently projected by 2050. Every model their study employed showed that a carbon tax which affected agriculture, which an economy-wide tax would do, increases food prices. Millions of starving people. I ask our opponents, is that enough to satisfy you? Our fourth argument is that the economic impact of climate change will be minimal, making extreme action unnecessary. In 2018, William Nordhaus of Yale University was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics for his development of a quantitative integrated assessment model, which accurately depicts the interplay between the climate and the global economy. His model predicted that a temperature rise of 3.66 degrees Celsius would result in global GDP being 3% lower than what it would otherwise be in 2100. Putting aside that current trends will put us well below this temperature increase, Nordhaus's model still projects a world in strong economic condition. In 2022, David Barker reported in Econ Journal Watch that present trends project a global per capita GDP in 2100 5.1 times greater than it is today. With Nordhaus's 3% reduction, that would still mean a 4.9-fold increase to global GDP by 2100. That is not a disaster by any stretch of the imagination. Therefore, leading economists hold that climate change will not result in severe economic damage. It is plainly unwise to adopt a policy which will cause immediate harm and reduce future growth, only to avert marginal impacts over the course of a century. Our fifth point is simple and delivers a coup de grace to the proposition. Adoption of a carbon tax by the United States will have essentially no impact on climate change. In 2019, Benjamin Zeiker of the American Enterprise Institute investigated the results of a carbon tax implementation. He ran the market effects of a $55 per ton domestic carbon tax through EPA climate models and found that the tax would only reduce global climate change by 0.015 degrees Celsius by the year 2100, which Zeiker illuminates is, quote, a figure smaller than the standard deviation of the service temperature record by an order of magnitude. Is that enough? I would think not. Consideration of public policy burdens us with a moral imperative to fully investigate costs and benefits. The cost of the resolution is far too high, and the benefits that it may bring are so marginal that any assertion that the scales tend towards its adoption is born of either factual ignorance or contemptible pretense. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Please remain as the lectern while we call up your cross-examination period, which will be conducted by BC's Nora Feeney for 3 minutes. Come on, Nora.
Hi. My first question focuses on your argument in regards to our plan hurting the economy. I was wondering if there is any piece of evidence that you addressed in regards to our dividend. A lot of your arguments regarding the economy were focused on how this will hurt families and households, and then you that's spilled over into food insecurity. But I just didn't hear a piece of evidence that addresses our dividend, which gives money back to families because of these higher prices.
Yes, well, I didn't address that directly, although my colleagues will later on. The majority of the economic damage would also come from the damage to businesses themselves. Businesses do drive the economy. And so the dividend isn't going to businesses. And so job layoffs and things like that, which would occur, aren't offset by that dividend.
So our dividends are going to households, which are including, people that work for businesses or business owners. So it's not really businesses that are being affected because it's going to households. So I just wanted to point out that the big part of our plan is being that it wouldn't really cause much economic downturn due to the fact that it's a plan that's allowing families to be unburdened by this. Additionally, I think you mentioned briefly other developing countries. Is that correct? And how the Paris climate agreement already allows for, I think my understanding, you're arguing that the status quo solves for these detrimental global warming effects, and that our plan is a little bit arbitrary due to that. Can you go into depth?
Yes, so our position is the position that was stated in the IPCC's Sixth Synthesis Report, which stated that we are, as a global community, on track to stay below 2 degrees Celsius. And we also believe that current policies in the United States, which is all we can control. Go ahead.
Our plan is looking to be adopted by Europe as well. So it's also a massive influx of countries that are also taking into effect that this needs to happen. So again, just with your argument, other countries are developing these, so it's not super correct to say that it wouldn't affect, because other countries are taking this plan into account as well, and it's looking they're doing the exact, if not the exact same thing. So I think that other countries are on board in terms of developing these taxes, which kind of refutes the idea that it's pointless. Do you agree? If other countries are in agreement with this plan?
I don't agree that we should unilaterally follow the lead of other countries. Historically, that
to
wouldn't
combat
have turned out
global
very well.
warming, you don't think that
We should
be a
combat global
unilateral
warming
thing
with our
for
own
global warming?
policies, yes.
Do you think that it's just falls in the hands of America to combat global warming, or do you think it?
Pretty well. Coming up next is actually our first round of rebuttals, correct? With the negative.
Affirmative team.
Is it?
Yeah, I think so.
No, sir.
Oh, I'm wrong.
That's why I'm moderator here, Chris.
Jumped the gun. I was so
I
excited.
appreciate the enthusiasm, though. I hope you still have it after this next rebuttal. So let's see what we have from Mr. Nick Drake, 4 to 6 minutes on the negative rebuttal. Come on up, Nick. Thank you, Nick.
Now, first, I'd like to mention, we heard Terrence briefly mention the most recent IPCC report. and share his belief, without backing it with evidence, that the US is not on track to meet its Paris Agreement goals. However, as Chandler actually quoted from this same report, it states clearly that we are on track to meet our goals without a carbon tax. Terrence also mentioned a border adjustment tax, and it seems to me like our opponents have already accepted the negative impacts a carbon tax would have on our economy. If not, then why else do they need to add to the resolution in order to make it work? Furthermore, I would have thought that our opponents would have at least researched the guidelines of the World Trade Organization. The WTO's General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, Article 3, Paragraph 2, stipulates that World Trade Organization members will not apply standards higher than those imposed on domestic products between imported goods and like domestic goods. In other words, the border adjustment tax our opponents are planning to add to their already unnecessary carbon tax is contrary to international law and would likely lead to sanctions. But let's assume that I'm wrong and the WTO doesn't find the border adjustment tax to be in violation of these standards. In that case, pre-WTO history has already proven that tariffs such as these will negatively infect the US economy, not protect it. Let's recall the Smoot-Hawley tariff signed into law by President Hoover on July 17, 1930. Brian Dugan, a senior editor at the Encyclopedia Britannica, wrote that many economists and historians consider this tariff to be one of the main factors that contributed to the Great Depression. The Smoot-Hawley tariff also raised pre-existing tariffs on foreign agricultural products and manufactured goods by some 20%. And within 2 years, this tariff being signed into law, 24 other countries had adopted their own bigger-than-neighbor policies, making worse an already struggling world economy and reducing global trade. U.S. imports from and exports to its then major trade partner Europe fell by roughly 2/3 between 1923 and 1932. All of this happened due to a tariff comparable in effect to the border adjustment tax our opponents are proposing. Historical events like these also highlight the influence that the U.S. has on the rest of the world. We can't solve global CO2 emissions on our own, but we can lead the way on how to do it correctly. This must be done with a well-thought-out plan, not one like our opponents are proposing that seems to be created in haste, built on a foundation of fear that change must come now or we are inevitably doomed tomorrow. The truth is we are not that close to the proverbial end. Professor Colin Goldblatt, Associate Professor of Earth Systems Evolution at the University of Victoria, in a study estimated that atmospheric CO2 levels would have to reach 30,000 parts per million in order to trigger a runaway greenhouse effect, in which the Earth would no longer be inhabitable as we know it to be. As of today, April 11th, 2023, NOAA's Global Monitoring Laboratory puts atmospheric CO2 levels at a mere 420.66 parts per million. This number may fluctuate daily, but NOAA has also calculated the annual growth of atmospheric carbon to be 2.33 parts per million. Now, simple math shows us that we are somewhere around 13,000 years away from the potential of a runaway greenhouse effect. But let's not forget that according to the EIA, US CO2 emissions from fossil fuels have been on the decline, down 5% on average each year since peaking in 2007. This shows that the US is already doing its part. A carbon tax would be overkill and have devastating effects on our economy. In 2019, Kevin Deoratna, senior statistician and research programmer at the Heritage Foundation, conducted a study using the EIA's National Energy Modeling System and found that a carbon tax set at the infeasible level of $300 per ton would only achieve about 58% reduction in US emissions by 2050. According to the standard EPA climate model, a tax set at this ungodly level would only avert about 0.1 degrees Celsius and 1 centimeter of sea rise by the year 2100. With that data in mind, I'm not sure what kind of effect our opponents think their measly $40 per ton tax is going to have, but results from this Heritage Foundation study found that a tax set at a high enough level to affect real climate change would also result in an average annual shortfall of 1.2 million jobs, reduce income of the typical family of four by nearly $8,000 a year, increase household electricity expenditures by well over 30%, and reduce the cumulative US GDP by $15 trillion by the year 2050. So now I ask, is this enough to satisfy our opponents? If not, how many American jobs, or for that matter, how many American lives are you willing to risk to satisfy your climate change expectations? It is obvious that the US citizens will be forced to bear the brunt of this tax burden. A carbon tax will be regressive, meaning it disproportionately affects the poor, as poorer households proportionately spend more on energy expenses. This is another negative impact our opponents expect the carbon tax to create, and that's why they're claiming they will issue tax rebates back to American households in an attempt to offset the tax burden they have created. While this may seem like a solution, I don't understand how these rebates will encourage companies to reduce their CO2 emissions. It's my understanding that in order to generate revenue from a punitive tax, like the ones our opponents are proposing, a perpetrator will have to continue to do the behavior that the tax is meant to penalize. This means that companies will have to continue to emit carbon in order to accumulate enough tax revenue to then issue rebates. Plus, the punishment for carbon consumption, if it's rebated back to consumers, what incentive is there to reduce consumption? Rebating increased prices does not reduce demand. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Drake. Now it is time for Boston College's very eager first affirmative rebuttal, 4 to 6 minutes, Mr. Christopher Cheek.
Climate change is real, and the consensus of studies agree, despite the negatives, sort of fear mongering. The world is warming and humans are behind this warming trend. Mark Linnaeus, a professor at Cornell University, examined a random subsection of all peer-reviewed papers discussing climate change and concluded that over 99% of papers about climate change say that it's caused by human activities. A recent publication by Anthony Costello from the UCL Institute for Global Health explored many of the dire consequences of global warming, including heat strokes, natural disasters, food shortages, inequality, sea level rise, and biodiversity collapse. Luke Kemp, a professor at Cambridge, wrote that global warming represents a threat that may, quote, surpass thresholds that triggered previous mass extinctions, end quote. One impact that Kemp highlights that negative evidence does not address is the threat of conflicts caused by climate-induced resource shortages. Their authors may be correct that climate change alone will not spill up to cause the planet to be too hot for us to live here, but if global warming sparks conflict and international crises, there is still an important impact worth abating because war is bad. Their study by Curry that they specifically cite cherry picks its evidence because the years that it chooses are years during the La Nina cycle, which naturally increase temperatures. However, overall analysis of warming shows that it is continuing throughout the years. The negative also contended that the Inflation Reduction Act provides sufficient funding to solve the climate crisis. There are three problems with this argument. First, a carbon tax is a better way to solve climate change. Mark Warren, an environmentalist, a member of the Citizens Climate Lobby, wrote that the IRA provisions are, quote, watered down, end quote, and that, quote, the U.S., as leader of the free world and historically highest emitter of greenhouse gases, bears a special responsibility to lead by example. Carbon fee and dividend will have a net positive long-term impact on the economy, and it can be effective enough to achieve U.S. climate goals. A carbon fee and dividend policy is the best option for the U.S. to address our greenhouse gas emissions problem, end quote. Given the seriousness of the climate crisis, it is good policy to pass a carbon tax and vote affirmative, even if there is some chance that the Inflation Reduction Act lessens the blow of climate change. Also, purely funding-based strategies to combat emissions fail because they do not actually force companies or people to change their behavior. Subsidies might encourage some to adopt climate-friendly practices, but, otherwise, there's no reason to adopt a climate-friendly practice. Emma Maris, an environmental philosopher and writer at The Atlantic, gives an example that, quote, electric vehicles will cut emissions, but plenty of people will still buy gasoline-powered cars and forgo that subsidy, end quote. The same is true of the dirtiest coal plants in America, which have been made less economically competitive by the IRA subsidies for clean energy, but can still operate in the status quo without any real impediment. Finally, the Inflation Reduction Act does nothing to solve emissions abroad. The United States is responsible for a significant portion of global emissions, but solutions for the climate crisis must cross America's borders into other countries. Mark Warren's argument about the United States' responsibility to clean up the planet is bolstered by the simple fact that even if the US were to become totally carbon neutral tomorrow, emissions from likes in India and China would still push us towards catastrophic warming. I'll get more onto the modeling effect of the aft later. The negative also contends that the plan would be terrible for the economy. And you should stick to facts here, just like the negative told you. The preponderance of empirical evidence suggests that a carbon tax does not harm economic growth. Both Australia and 14 EU countries implemented carbon taxes and did not suffer negative economic consequences. Evidence for the effectiveness of Australia's tax is difficult to find because it only lasted for a year, but the carbon tax implemented in a number of EU countries has shown no signs of hurting economic growth. A Gilbert and Metcalf Gilbert Metcalf and James Stock, who are economists at Tufts and Harvard respectively, concluded in a study that EU carbon tax policy shows, quote, no evidence of adverse effects on GDP growth or total employment, unquote. Further, a study by Greg Bertelson and Katrina Rourke from the Climate Leadership Council found that a border-adjusted carbon tax would increase jobs and innovation because companies want to produce new technology to comply. Also, the affirmative proposal will actually benefit American companies. American companies already comply with a number of existing environmental regulations that make American production much less carbon intensive than it is almost anywhere else in the world. The border adjustment tax makes other countries, companies, pay because they aren't as carbon, friendly. Companies have to follow US regulations no matter what. It's just a question of whether we make US companies more competitive, which would obviously boost the American economy. They also made a claim that climate change is not key to the economy. First, we've given other impacts of climate change, which is important to remember, but also, obviously, climate change has a massive impact on the economy. It's impossible to do business in a hurricane zone. Massive natural disasters cause billions of dollars in damage. Just watch the TV and talk about the billions of dollars that have been spent on repairing from hurricanes. These are all things that would become more likely in a world where we have increased warming. They also made a claim that the AF wouldn't solve because it doesn't spill over to other countries. Only affecting the United States is not enough, which is why we include a border adjustment fee. The border adjusted carbon tax imposes a tariff on goods imported from countries that do not have a carbon tax similar to the affirmative's proposal. Because countries want access to the United States trade market, they would choose to impose their own carbon taxes. United States Senator Mitt Romney backed up this claim in an interview when he said that, quote, trading partners would find it in their interest to skip a US border adjustment by implementing their own carbon tax, end quote. It would create a positive feedback cycle in which more countries impose carbon taxes that are border adjusted, and therefore the incentives to have a border adjusted carbon tax and to, have a carbon tax increase and get China and India and important polluters on board. They said that it would be illegal under the World Trade Organization. Paul Krugman, a distinguished economist, wrote that a border adjustment would be considered a domestic tax on purchasers in the United States, not a foreign tariff, which is what the WTO prohibits. He compared the border adjustment fee to the very existing legal international value added tax. Finally, they said a tax would fail because it would simply be passed on to consumers. This argument misunderstands the role of the free market of American companies. Companies will be incentivized to develop less carbon intensive options so that they can charge consumers less with the carbon tax, right? If I can make something that is cleaner and I pay less tax, I'm going to be able to charge consumers less and they will buy my product, which would be good.
Thank you, Mr. Kuhn. I think now we can see why he was so eager to get up here and speak his piece. I think we have some global warming on these microphones right now, so I'm gonna give him a moment to cool down. That actually concludes the first round of debate. That was your opening salvo of constructive rebuttal and cross-examination speeches. And we have one more round of constructive arguments and rebuttals before we close out for each team. And I'd just like to acknowledge before we start the second round, not only the friends and family in attendance here today, but our amazing coaches. As you can tell, the skill level here isn't accidental. Everyone here is very intelligent, they're well educated, but they're also very well coached. And one of them is in attendance today, Professor John Katsulas from Boston College. Want to acknowledge him and all of his work to get everyone prepared, as well as our volunteer coach, Patrick Waldinger, who's on the virtual panel. Patrick, thank you so much. The NPDL relies heavily on our volunteers, and Patrick actually represents the University of Miami, and he's the president of the American Debate Association. So we're fortunate to have him, who lent weeks and weeks of coaching our MCC team here very rigorously. So thank you for the coaching, thank you for the preparation. You're about to see that come to full fruition here on the back half. So with that said, I'd also like to acknowledge our hardworking timer, Brittany Lamar here in the middle, making sure everyone stays on track, including me. And it's not an easy task. I talk a lot of shit, but I just want to acknowledge that a lot of work goes into this, and it's really important that you understand what you're seeing, including the judging. I introduced the judging panel earlier, but just so the audience here and at home understands what these amazing presenters are being scored on, there's 6 main criteria. It's analysis of the information, the reasoning, the evidence, the organization of their arguments, the refutation you see back and forth, and the delivery, in which you got to believe what you're saying. And I think you're hearing and seeing all of that fully articulated here and personified. So I'm excited to start the second round with our next speaker. He is representing MCC. He's their second negative constructive argument, 6 to 8 minutes. Please give a warm welcome to Mr. Jared Sherwater.
So in this speech, I'll advance 4 more arguments as to why a carbon tax is both unnecessary and unwise. My first point will be on the catastrophic impact a carbon tax would have on the steel industry. A carbon tax would bring us back to an industrial collapse by raising the cost of production across multiple sectors. According to a study from Morgenstern from 2007, a $10 per ton CO2 tax would reduce steel production by 6%. Given the number our opponents propose, we can only imagine how much worse the impact on the steel industry would be with their figure. Steel is both a fundamental building block in our economy and an engine for good-paying jobs for more than 1 million Americans. For every direct steelmaking job, the industry supports 7 jobs in other economic sectors. According to the Alliance for American Manufacturing in 2016, the United States cannot continue to lose its manufacturing base due to the market distorting foreign competition or government policies that discourage domestic investment and productive capacity. Should this happen, millions of additional jobs would be lost and our economic strength as a nation would be further damaged, said the American Iron and Steel Institute in their 2016 public policy agenda. Tanks and ships are made from steel. Do we want to decrease our ability to produce defensive armaments while Russia is invading a neighboring country and China is menacing Taiwan? Considering this information, it is easy to conclude that a tax would compromise our national security as well as our economy. Our next point addresses the arbitrary nature of a carbon tax. Specifically, there is no consensus on what the appropriate level of a carbon tax should be. Our neighbor Canada serves as one example. They had a $50 per ton tax this year, and next year it will increase to $65. It will continue to increase until it reaches $170 by 2030. Why are our opponents so confident in their figure if it differs so wildly from the $170 tax sought by Canada? A per ton carbon tax is meant to reflect the social cost of burning 1 ton of carbon, thereby accounting for the negative environmental externalities of emission. However, the scientific community cannot establish what the social cost of carbon is. A 2016 Environmental Protection Agency report championed the conclusion that the social cost of burning 1 ton of carbon was $42. However, if we read that publication comprehensively, we find that it also claims that the value may be closer to $12 per ton, or perhaps as high as $123. Only 2 years later, a report by the same agency rebuked these values and argued for a social cost of only $7. This variation proves the subjective foundations of our opponent's plan. It is impossible to develop prudent policy with such wild inconsistency. We now turn to another flaw in the proposition. Our opponent's plan makes us reliant on the international community for its success. Hearings in the United States Senate as recently as this February established this. Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana asked Dr. Holtz-Eakin, a member of the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission at Stanford, what the adoption of new policies such as a carbon tax would accomplish. Kennedy asked, how much would that lower world temperatures? Dr. Holtz-Eakin responded, I can't say because I don't know what China, India, and the rest of the world has done. No one can know for sure, Senator. That depends on the rest of the world. Unilateral action by the United States alone is not enough. The success of the affirmative plan is totally averting climate change, is completely reliant on the cooperation from the Chinese government. That is not hyperbole, it is fact. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change announced in 2022 that we need to reduce global carbon emissions by 25% by 2030 to achieve the goal of net zero carbon emissions by 2070 to keep warming under 2 degrees Celsius by 2100. According to a 2022 press release from the World Bank, China is responsible for 1/3 of the global greenhouse emissions. Therefore, even if every country in the world achieved net zero carbon emissions by 2070, China alone could prevent us from achieving our emissions in reduction the goal by a wide margin if they refuse to cooperate. The unlikelihood of Chinese cooperation and their ability to independently prevent achievement of global climate goals underscores the necessity of having a strong economy which can develop new technologies and adapt to the climate change effects. As my teammates previously discussed, our current efforts, investments, and economic growth give us that flexibility. Our opponents' reliance on a carbon tax and consequent reliance on China do not. We stand on historical and contemporary precedent in our claim that China can't be relied on to be transparent and to cooperate with the rest of the world. We just had a global pandemic that killed millions, and as the Department of Energy and Federal Bureau of Investigation announcements earlier this year have proven, China likely lied to the global community about the origin of the virus. It was also well established that they lied about its severity in 2019 and early 2020. If China cannot be trusted to cooperate with the rest of the world during a global pandemic that was killing millions, What makes anyone rational think that they would do something that would be detrimental to their economy for the well-being of the environment? China is relying on coal, and their leaders aren't going to compromise their economy and shut down their primary source of energy just to appease foreign countries. If they were planning on using less coal, they aren't showing it. According to the Wall Street Journal last year, China consumed more coal, built more coal capacity, and improved a record number of potential future coal power plant additions. Also, coal use rose 4.3% in 2022, compared to the previous year, a higher than expected increase that came even as the economy was kept down by widespread COVID-19 lockdowns. China is also the world's largest steel producer, producing over 1,000 million tons in 2021, also 10 times the amount of the second largest producer, India, at 118 million tons, according to the World Atlas report in 2022. We cannot compel these nations to adopt a carbon tax, and attempting to coerce them to do so through trade tariffs would almost certainly decrease, not improve, their cooperation. My final point is that the wealthy that advocate for this tax will not feel this tax nearly as much as our nation's poor. France's yellow vest protesters of recent years serve as an example of lower income individuals protesting the harm they are forced to endure by increased fuel and energy taxes, taxes which were subsequently reduced because of their efforts. We have problems today affecting today. And as Chandler pointed out, a carbon tax would harm our economy's ability to address them. A recent study from the United Kingdom's Department of Energy and Climate Change found that as families become less financially stable, they do more damage to the environment. People are starving today. People are homeless today. There are 151,000 homeless people in California alone, according to the World Population Review. A carbon tax pits the planet against the poor. When people can't afford food, they starve. And according to the UN, 25,000 people already die every day from starvation. When people can't afford heat, they freeze. 1,300 Americans died of exposure in 2022, according to Newsweek. But hey, what is sacrificing the poor today for the beachfront property of tomorrow? We are not debating the importance of moving towards carbon neutrality and the fight against global warming. We are debating the enactment of an arbitrary carbon tax fueled by alarmist mentality, and that would be a burden on our economy and especially on the most vulnerable amongst us. We do not and cannot endorse such a rash course of action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sherwater. And now in response from the affirmative team from Boston College, 6 to 8 minutes. Let's hear from Mr. Owen Engler. Owen, come on up.
Good afternoon. Global warming is a threat to the continued existence of all life on Earth. In our first speech, we cited the Linus study that found 99% of the peer-reviewed scientific literature concluded global warming is real and caused by humans. The latest IPCC report from March 23 warned that the climate time bomb is ticking. Andrew Friedman, climate writer for Axios, reported on March 20th, 23, that the IPCC report claimed multiple lines of evidence proved that climate impacts are occurring faster than previously known, including an increase of extreme weather events, bleaching coral reefs, and rising sea levels. And a February 2013 study by international scientists concluded that climate models are underestimating the amount of warming by not accounting for many positive feedbacks. CNN reporter Laura Pattison wrote on February 17th, 23, that the study identified 41 possible feedback loops and found that 27 of them will drive up temperatures, with only 7 restraining warming. William Ripple, professor of ecology at Oregon State and a lead author of the study, told CNN that forest die-off, smoldering pitlands, and thawing permafrost were particularly worrisome. The study warned that these dangerous feedbacks could cause runaway global warming, making the Earth uninhabitable. Given these existential dangers, there is an urgent need for the United States to enact a carbon tax. This is the consensus view among the best economists. In 2019, a statement signed by 3,589 economics, including 3 former chairs of the Federal Reserve, 27 Nobel laureates, and 15 former chairs of the Council of Economic Advisors, supported the view that, quote, a carbon tax offers the most effective lever to reduce carbon emission at the scale and speed that is necessary, end quote. A carbon tax is far superior to the approach of the IRA, which relies on subsidies and tax credits. By placing a price on carbon throughout the economy, only a carbon tax forces a rapid shift away from fossil fuels. Shihoko Goto of the Wilson Center argued in 22 that relying on IRA is short-sighted as tax credits are incapable of promoting a rapid structural shift away from fossil fuels. As we stated in our first speech, subsidies for EVs are not environmentally positive if the electricity generated comes from coal. Moreover, by artificially depressing energy prices, IRA will discourage the adoption of energy conservation measures vital to reducing carbon emissions. Nor will IRA subsidies and tax credits bring the U.S. into compliance with our Paris commitments. The point was made by economics James Boyce in our first speech. Unlike the IRA, the CLC plan will achieve a 50% reduction in emissions by 2035. 50%. And according to modeling by Stanford and the Resources for the Future, the CLC plan will put the US on a path to be totally carbon-free by mid-century. Additionally, IRS subsidies will do nothing to encourage other countries to reduce their emissions. Nothing. That requires imposing a border carbon adjustment tax. The border carbon adjustment tax enhances the efficacy of the US domestic carbon tax and provides 3 benefits. First, it prevents the leakage of carbon emissions. US companies have no incentive to relocate abroad because they will have to pay the carbon tax if they import goods back to the US. A 2020 study by the Tax Foundation indicated that a meta-analysis of 25 studies found that a BCA or border carbon reduction reduces the rate of leakage to 6%, with some studies concluding it entirely eliminated the risk of leakage. Second, a BCA adopted by the US will be a strong incentive for our trading partners to enact an equivalent carbon tax so their companies can avoid paying the border tax. In fact, the European Union is in the process of adopting their own BCA. So if the US does not adopt a carbon tax, US companies exporting goods to the EU will have to pay a border tax. Katrina Rourke of the CLC argued in 21 that if the US allowed a carbon tax or adopted a carbon tax and a BCA, then the UK, Canada, Mexico, and Japan would soon follow suit. With so many large economies joining the US to impose BCAs, George Shultz and Ted Halsman maintain that would exert sufficient market leverage to force China and force India to get on board. Third, enacting a carbon tax and BCA will boost the competitiveness of US companies. According to a 21 report by Lauren Ban of the Alliance for American Manufacturing, 75% of US imports come from less carbon efficient countries, 75%, while goods manufactured in the US are 80% more carbon efficient than the world average. However, without imposing any price on carbon, US manufacturers receive 0 credit for their cleaner manufacturing options or operations. However, if the US enacted a carbon tax and BCA, Ban argues that would unlock a competitive advantage for a variety of US industries, including steel, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, electrical equipment, rubber, plastic products, automobiles, and more. Finally, arguments that imposing a carbon tax will harm the US economy are simply misguided. In fact, according to Greg Bettelstein and Katrina Rourke, an economic analysis of the Climate Leadership Council's carbon tax and BCA plan suggests that it will unlock 1.4 trillion in capital investment for innovation and create 1.6 million jobs by 2035. Academic research substantiates the positive economic outcomes for enacting a carbon tax. In a 23 study, Alan Shapiro and Gilbert Metcalf, both economists at Tufts, found that a carbon tax triggers technological innovations which generate positive macroeconomic and welfare effects. A large body of empirical research now exists examining the economic effects of the enactment of carbon taxes by British Columbia and 15 other countries in Europe. The empirical evidence does not support the hypothesis that carbon taxes will harm the economy. Tufts economics Gilbert Metcalf and Harvard economics James Stock wrote in a National Bureau of Economic Research working paper in 2020 that the empirical literature finds no adverse impact on GDP of the British Columbia carbon-based tax on a difference analysis of a panel of Canadian provinces over 1990 to 2016. Using a panel of European countries over 1985 to 2017, there was a modest positive impact on GDP. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Engler. And now leading off our last round of rebuttals, also from BC, for 3 to 5 minutes, please give a warm welcome to Mr. John Sexton.
Okay, first of all, they start to try to read to you like all these disadvantages regarding steel, but we would tell you the negative contends that carbon tax would harm American steel manufacturers, but we have two major responses. First, a carbon tax would not majorly change the cost of American steel. The steel industry is already subject to a number of regulations and tariffs that mean price shocks and changes are relatively insulated. An article by the Climate Leadership Conference recently found that, quote, purchasers of steel are projected to see moderately higher steel prices. These effects fall well within the range of typical steel price volatility and are smaller in magnitude than existing trade measures. Further, the affirmative proposal would actually benefit American steel producers because American steel producers already comply with a number of existing environmental regulations that make American steel production much less carbon intensive and much more expensive than production of steel in other nations. Lauren Bond from the Alliance for American Manufacturing wrote that American steel is already produced in a manner that's 80% less carbon intensive than the global average. A border adjusted carbon tax would level the playing field for American corporations by penalizing more carbon intensive industrial apparatuses in other countries and incentivizing other countries to adopt regulatory regimes that would decrease carbon emissions. Secondly, they try to tell you that like British Columbia proves that our tax won't work, but the negatives empirics are based solely on the economics of British Columbia are wrong. British Columbia's carbon tax was not border adjusted and solely affected a single province. It also lowered taxes for all taxpayers instead of rebate dividends for residents. That's distinctly different than a policy that would apply to the entire United States and make outsourcing uncompetitive. Furthermore, the previous affirmative rebuttal already hashed out the empirical evidence from EU countries that implemented a carbon tax, but our empirical example is better than the negatives because it actually affected the entire economy of several nations instead of applying to a single province. Finally, even with the example of British Columbia, there is not any clear evidence that the carbon tax harmed economic growth. Sean Bray, a policy analyst at the Tax Foundation, wrote that even though the tax did not decrease in employment and carbon-intensive industries, it did, quote, raise employment in the aggregate, end quote, by creating many new jobs in the service sector. Furthermore, studies like that of John Thomas Bernard and Marar Kenshian found that the carbon tax had no impact on the GDP of British Columbia. Quibbling about the exact number of the carbon tax does not disprove the affirmative's desirability. If a carbon tax is good for solving climate change and boosting the United States' economy, we have good evidence that a $40 per ton standard would achieve that goal. So, thirdly, they try to tell you that other countries are key to solving. The previous speech already explained to you how the border adjustment would spill over to other countries. Even if China does have a propensity to lie, they would want to comply with a carbon tax. Otherwise, their companies would struggle to be competitive in the US. China would rather boost economic growth than pollute the planet, and following the American example would achieve both goals. David Bailey, research director at Climate Leadership Council, wrote recently that a border adjustment fee would create a sort of feedback cycle by which more and more countries chose to implement carbon taxes to access the United States' market, which means that countries that aren't in the club have even more incentives to impose a carbon tax. Those incentives would be enough to encourage recalcitrant polluters, even the likes of India and China, to make deep cuts in their carbon emissions. Finally, they try to bring up these other problems, like they pointed to starvation as bad, but a warming climate actually makes food scares much worse. Professor Georgina Gustin wrote recently that, quote, climate change is a threat multiplier making hunger emergencies worse. Improved models and updated climate data projects an alarming picture. More crops are predicted to react negatively. Projected yields of corn dropped by more than 20% globally across the world and in many breadbasket regions. This is going to occur in the next couple of years. IPCC found that climate change has already lowered crop productivity in the tropics. For all these reasons, please vote for the affirmative.
Thank you, Mr. Sexton. And the final rebuttal from our negative MCC team, 3 to 5 minutes. Please give a warm welcome to Jason DeLong. Jason, come on up.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. I want to start off by clarifying that never once did we ever say that climate change was not being caused by humans. And additionally, I'm surprised you'd mention Australia, considering their tax only lasted 2 years. They repealed it because of its negative economic effects. And I notice you love peer-reviewed journals. So since we're talking peer review, I think it should be understood that in 2022, the World Bank report examined 30 years of scholarship on carbon tax in peer-reviewed journals and found only a handful even examined the effects on the environment. Even fewer include the environmental benefits of an overarching assessment of the costs and benefits of a carbon tax to begin with. Now, I know you said $40 is the fix-all price to start this tax, but I want to point out that in 2012, the U.S. Energy Information Administration, they made a comparison analysis for a carbon tax. It starts at $25 and raises by 5% per year. Compared to the baseline case without the tax, this would cut family income for a family of 4 by $1,400 to $1,900 by a year by 2035. Raise energy bills by $500 per year, increase gasoline by 10%, and lead to an aggregate loss of more than 1 million jobs. And that would do nothing but hurt our economy, which is the same thing that an economy-wide tax would do. And it should be noted that Ann Smith and David Harrison, VP and co-chair of NERA's Global Environmental Practice, they found a carbon tax would have a net negative effect on consumption, investment, and labor markets, resulting in lower revenue from things like capital and labor. As such, even a high tax on carbon would have a net revenue significantly less than the projected carbon tax proceeds themselves. This, of course, is because existing tax revenue will fall due to lessened economic activity. At a $20 a ton case, the amount of tax revenue reductions range from $43 to $145 billion by 2053. And an 80% carbon reduction case, the loss in federal revenue rises to $910 billion by 2053. And the thing is it doesn't have to, because we're doing plenty in the private sector already. And I want to thank my opponents for helping me prove this, because you see, in 2022, Boston College's own Center for Corporate Citizenship conducted a survey among their 500 plus corporate members and found that the proportion of executives reporting quantitative goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions had increased by 44% since 2020, with 76% stating their companies have carbon offsets in place and 67% are set or in the progress of setting internal carbon pricing. That is from your school. Thank you for that. In addition, the private sector is also doing a lot that we don't want to hurt. In 2021, Ben Ho of the Columbia University Climate School, along with the American Economic Association, found that there are really few major sources of carbon emissions in the US that are not already regulated by existing policies that place high implicit price on carbon reduction. The Renewable Portfolio Standard, tax credits for solar and wind, and subsidies for electric cars have implicit carbon pricing ranging anywhere from $200 to $2,100 per ton. These taxes will only hurt these already effective and efficient policies. Now, I know we've heard a lot about dividends from my opponents, and they seem to think that that's going to be the cure-all for this. But I want to make sure you understand that the Fraser Institute examined carbon tax in 14 OECD countries, including Canada, and found that on average, 74% of carbon tax revenues in high-income OECD countries go directly into general revenues for governments with no specific use. 12% are earmarked for environmental spending, and a mere 14% are what actually get returned back to the citizens that pay the very tax. And, you know, that just opens up all kinds of loopholes and exemptions for the likes of the companies who are the strongest emitters. As Yes and Rack pointed out from Corporate Night, that's an economic research corporation, 2022, Suncor, Canada's largest carbon emitter, paid only $59 million in compliance costs before offsets. Put another way, for every barrel of oil Suncor sold, $80, only 16 cents was spent on carbon tax. Thanks to loopholes and exemptions, Suncor's average carbon cost is only $2.10 per ton. That's 1/14 the full carbon price, while drivers paid $30 per ton at the gas tax at the pump that very same year. None of this matters, though, if it's not helping the environment. And according to the United Nations, globally, despite 31 high-income countries having imposed carbon tax, cap and trade markets, or a combination of the two, greenhouse gas emissions rose 62% between 1990, the baseline of the Kyoto Climate Accord, and 2019. Listen, we already have a dumb, expensive, economically inefficient tax code that punishes income and investment and makes it hard for Americans to compete globally. The last thing we need to do is compound that by introducing the first ever untested economy-wide tax, especially one based off science that's unproven, where politicians get to set price for whatever their political agenda is at that moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. DeLong. At this stage, each team will now have 90 seconds to make closing remarks, and we will begin with BC's Nora Feeney. Nora, come on up.
Judges, it's imperative that the affirmative should win the debate, and that's for 3 reasons. First, overwhelming scientific evidence proves global warming is an existential threat, and the IRA is not going to achieve enough emission reductions to get the US in compliance with its international commitments. Second, the Climate Leadership Council plan of a $40 per ton carbon tax, along with the BCA, will lead to domestic and global emission reductions by other countries. Third, the affirmative's carbon tax will not harm the economy. The consensus of economic studies conclude a carbon tax with the BCA will stimulate tech innovation and thus boost the competitiveness of US companies, including carbon-intensive industries like steel. And the empirical evidence from the EU and British Columbia does not demonstrate carbon taxes have harmed enough economic growth. Finally, global warming is the greatest threat to economic growth, and by slowing warming, the plan prevents the decline of the US and global economy, which is why it's imperative that you vote for the affirmative. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Feeney. And to close out our debate with their final remarks, Patrick Dapolito, MCC.
Economics and practical consequences condemn this resolution. Implementing any economy-wide tax in the United States based solely on emissions will have a disastrous effect on the economy. Furthermore, redistribution of the tax revenue would negate any disincentive to reduce emissions at all. Chandler pointed out that a federally imposed carbon offset would reduce economic growth and have a devastating impact on middle and lower class consumers. Nick went on to say that a carbon offset would reduce the GDP by $15 trillion and reduce jobs by 1.2 million per year over the next 20 years. An economic contraction of this magnitude would be devastating to the working class of the United States. Furthermore, as Jared told us, it would harm the US steel industry and threaten our national security. Even if the country were to adopt this risky policy, it would have little impact on global carbon emissions. Countries such as China and India must be the focus of reduction efforts. We believe that any proposed solution should account for the United States' economic well-being, as well as recognize this reality. The proposal at issue fails to accomplish this. Any border adjustment will be contrary to WTO agreements, a flaw which our opponents never addressed. Finally, we maintain that current global strategies are sufficient. The IPCC has confirmed with high confidence that we are on track to stay below a 2-degree increase. In fact, Chandler mentioned that the IRA alone would reduce emissions by up to 77%. Today, you have heard each of my colleagues ask, is that enough? We now say explicitly that enough is enough. Thank you.
All right, let's give another round of applause for both of these teams. I think that we may not agree on tax policy here today, but I think we can all agree that nobody's patience was taxed by these two amazing teams. And yeah, I get paid to say the cheesy stuff, but it's no less true. To let the record reflect. And while our judges now, your fates are now in the hands of our judges, and they tally their scores, I'd like to ask both teams if they mind having a representative or two as the judges tally these scores, perhaps speak on this unique experience as a reflection of what you just, a lot of work and energy and preparation went into this. This didn't happen accidentally. And I wonder if if any of the team members would like to represent that. Chandler, would you like to lead us off in that discussion?
Right. So before I get into how important this experience is, there's a list of people I want to thank. First of all, Boston College, especially Coach Katsulas. He's an excellent coach. He was the MDOC's coach for our debate against MIT. So he does an excellent job preparing people. And thank you so much for your work for the NPDL. And then also our opponents, Terrence, Christopher, Owen, John, and Nora. Thank you very much for coming up here. We really appreciate it. We also have our two alternates, which you didn't hear from today, but that doesn't mean that they were in the background of our preparation. They did an excellent job. We had multiple practice debates and they did a great job playing Boston College. So Chris and Ross, thank you very much. And then also our great coach, Patrick Waldinger from the University of Miami did an excellent job preparing us as well. And from the NPDL, thank you to Daniel and Brittany. Thank you to the panel of judges, shameless plug. And from MDOC and MCC, there's a huge list of people we could thank, but particularly Tricia Flanders and Ken Shaw for setting us up here today. Yeah, and also Resident Mark Cardilli, who helped with all the tech stuff. So good luck, buddy. All right. So for the experience itself, it's hard to overstate how important this is. When this time in my life began, it was about 3 years ago. I was in a place where books were considered contraband. We weren't allowed to have them. It wasn't in this state, so don't be mad at Maine. And then to come here and have this opportunity, I never would have thought anything like this would have been possible. Again, thank you to the Maine Department of Corrections. Thank you guys for being here. Words fail to express how important this is to every one of us here. I know there's a lot of guys back in the units watching us. There's guys in other states, Tennessee, Colorado, California, watching us today. So it means a lot. And I hope that we showed that really good things can come from this. So thank you.
Thank you, Chandler. Very, very well said and obviously well felt. Would you like to, Mr. Engler, please?
Hello, just echoing everything that's been said from the Boston College side, we'd like to thank the Maine Department of Corrections as well as all of our opponents. This was a great experience for us and we really did enjoy coming up here, and just thank you everyone for your hospitality on behalf of Boston College. And also just to reiterate on a personal level, this is something that I'm truly passionate about. And it's something that I think is really, really important. And I do commend each and every one of you guys for participating, and as well as this program just for occurring, because this means like so much to people's lives, including people who are staying here, but also people who are not here, just to be here and helping doing our part. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Engler. And that's the beauty of what the NPDL tries to amplify, is not just the voices of incarcerated people and higher education in prison, which is what we are all about, including higher education in our partners from these amazing colleges and universities who have the grace to join us. Not many people volunteer to come and spend their time in prison. And not only our volunteer coaches and judges, but our participants. Thank you very much. Thanks. It really is a beautiful form of social diplomacy. And when you see who's in this room, we have so many different communities of practice here with our amazing partners at Maine DOC, who not only support higher education in prison to allow for this to happen, for people to learn and grow and evolve in positive, healthy ways, but then again, to open the doors for these sort of interactions that really transcend any sort of barriers and uncage minds. And I think that, to your point, Mr. Engler, that does go both ways. There was a lot of ignorance in this world. These are very complex public policy issues. And when you see and hear how well they are analyzed and discussed, and you see the beauty of being able to disagree without being disagreeable, I think that's a lesson to the world and at large. And I think it really models what that can look like when you're able to actually take time to hear each other and understand where other people are coming from who may think differently than you. And that's what we saw here today. I commend you all on all of those efforts. And I'd like to really promote next week's event. All right, if you thought this was special, we're just getting started. The women's team is in the house and they'll be taking on Harvard University next week on the issue of gender equality and fair pay. And that is going to be another dynamic event Tuesday at 1 o'clock, free live stream links on the npdl.org website. Please tune in and support this work as we continue to build bridges, defy stereotypes, and promote the power, the transformational power of education in this world. With that said, are our judges ready to present scores? They're still tabulating. Awesome. That gives us more opportunity to incorporate the voices of our participants, because you've heard plenty from me. And I would like to ask if anyone else who's participated would like to take an opportunity to express anything that they've seen or heard here today, or their own educational experience. Come on up, Rick.
Yeah, so when Chandler first came to me and said, hey, we're doing another debate. We won last time. Do you want to come and win again? I said, I'm sorry, guys. I said, yeah, of course. I'd love to. I jumped right in, having absolutely no idea what to expect. I'd never done anything like this before. I know there might be some people in the audience who might disagree with that, thinking I'm a great debater, but I've never done anything like this before. And I think we were a week, maybe 2 weeks in. At that point in time, John was still kind of working with us, and he had handed a stack of information, and I came to Chandler and I said, bro, you got the wrong guy. There was so much more research involved than I would have ever expected. And, to get a little personal and, really honest, I really didn't believe in myself to be able to go through this process. I really thought I don't really read very well. So I was like, I'm not going to be able to keep up with the rest of these guys. We have gentlemen here who are working on master's degrees, and, currently I'm just majoring in liberal studies. So I really thought I was way out of my league. But Chandler continued to encourage me. The rest of the team had my back the whole time. And it was really great in this kind of environment to be able to experience that kind of camaraderie. So I can only thank the National Prison Debate League for being able to create that environment for us, because the last 3 months or so really have been some of the best times I've ever had locked up. So thank you. Thank you.
It's a hard act to follow, because that's exactly what you hope to have an impact and be able to create opportunities, because they're so scarce. And I think everyone here understands the value of not just how you invest your time in life, but behind these walls, it matters. And when you're building yourselves up and you're able to actually apply that knowledge in this kind of a forum and against, a legit college debate team. I started in the same space where 20 years ago in Massachusetts, we didn't have access to higher education programs at the time. And that's how we started this whole debate program. And our roots are based in that. We were all looking to evolve and pursue higher education, and we had to teach ourselves. And then we had to test that knowledge against each other. And it just kind of became what it was naturally, organically, to what it is today. And like I said, I can't thank all of our partners, especially DOCs who open their doors, because it does take trust. It does take collaboration. It takes people not just seeing your vision, but buying into it because they see the value and impact it has on the human lives that are participating and are inspired by it. As Chandler really pointed out, I want to emphasize that many of these live streams are broadcast within other state systems. So we are hoping that people can see the power of education and aspire that same pathway to change their quality of life. And again, decarcerate their minds. Your physical body may be stuck in this space, but it doesn't mean you have to live there. right? You can always transcend negative circumstances, as you saw here today. And it's really about a state of mind, and it is about elevating and evolving and being able to apply that knowledge once you attain it. And that's what the beauty of this interaction is, in which we can share a space and have these sort of discussions that don't happen often. And you look around at the diversity in this room, and it is totally inspirational. So thank you all very much for that. Next week, we have not only the women's debate that I've already plugged, but we also have on the 25th, the following Tuesday, another dynamic event with Maine State Prison against Wake Forest University, who are the reigning national champions on the issue of abolishing life without parole sentences in this country. So that's also going to be another powerful finale event for the NPDL this spring here in partnership with Maine DOC. And we ask that everyone tune in these next 3 Tuesdays and support these events and these amazing people that are doing this amazing work, and share those links and make sure that people see what's going on behind these walls. Okay. With that said, our judges are ready to present the scores. Chief Judge Helwich, are you ready to announce the winner, sir?
Yeah, I am. I wanted to say that I was very impressed by the level of
You gotta
preparation.
get your microphone working so you can announce the winner.
Can you hear me now?
Sorry about that, folks. It's a little technical glitch on our part. All right. Chief Judge Helwich, do you have a winner to announce for us today, sir?
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
All right, good. So I just want to say I was really impressed by the level of preparation by the participants, the amount of detail that folks had. I thought the evidence quality overall was quite good, as was the effort to refute what the other side said. And I wanted to underscore something that the last participant said, is that one thing that debate does, and I've devoted my life to teaching it, is it helps people organize, synthesize, and make sense of information to compare ideas and then make better judgments about what it is they think we should or should not do. And I think that what we saw today was an excellent example of a high-level policy debate. And I just want to applaud all the participants for their efforts today. I thought it was fantastic. So in terms of the scores, our esteemed Dr. Mitchell awarded 102 points to the affirmative from Boston College and 116 points to the MCC debate team. Dr. Davidson awarded 128 points to Boston College and 122 points to the MCC team. Director O'Gorman awarded 116 points to the affirmative from Boston College and 117 to the MCC team. Dr. Irizarry awarded 134 points to the affirmative from Boston College, 138 to the MCC team. And then in my scoring, I awarded 112.5 points to the team from Boston College, 115.5 points to the team from MCC. If you're writing this down, that means it's a 4-1 decision for the negative from MCC. And the debate was decided in the last 2 speeches. Both Danielle and I had the affirmative winning until the closing speeches. So congratulations to everybody, and especially the MCC debate team.
Thank you both very much for an amazing debate. I think we can all agree there were no losers here today. Have a great night. Thank you for supporting. Hope to see you next week. How you feeling, buddy?
Congrats, you all.
Another job. Yeah. Yeah.